On the 10th of May, 2020, an 84-year-old man died of a stroke at his home in Marriottsville, Maryland. He had worked at NASA for almost 40 years. He held patents on the ceramic panels that stopped spacecraft burning up on re-entry. He had worked on the program that put men on the moon. The colleagues who sat beside him for 4 decades knew him as a quiet, private man with one small habit none of them could ever explain. Every year, at Halloween, he left town. 18 months after he was buried, a researcher matched his name to a case file that had been sealed for 72 years. The man who helped put astronauts on the moon was the boy at the center of the most famous exorcism in history. His name was Ronald Edwin Hunkeler. In 1949, when he was 13 years old, Catholic priests performed somewhere between 20 and 30 rites of exorcism on him, most of them in a locked room on the 5th floor of a hospital in South St. Louis. One of those priests kept a diary. He wrote in it daily, for the church, and he never intended a single word of it to be read outside that room. The diary stayed hidden for nearly 30 years. When it finally surfaced, it did not say what the world had spent 3 decades assuming it said. Because the strangest thing about the true story behind The Exorcist is not how closely the film follows it. It is how far the film had to travel to get there. We should begin with a correction, because the most widely repeated fact about this case is wrong. The family did not live in Mount Rainier, Maryland. That address has been printed for 70 years. It came from a newspaper headline, and the newspaper was mistaken. They lived a short distance away, in Cottage City. The researcher Mark Opsasnik established this in an investigation published in Strange magazine in the year 2000, by doing what nobody in 5 decades had bothered to do. He knocked on doors and checked the records. Hold on to that, because it is the shape of the entire story. A great deal of what the public believes here was never verified by anybody. It was printed once, and then copied. What is documented is this. Ronald was an only child from a German Lutheran family. He was close to an aunt from St. Louis, a spiritualist, who had taught him to use a Ouija board. In late January of 1949, she died. Within days, the family began to hear scratching inside the walls. They called an exterminator. He found nothing. The sounds continued for roughly 10 days, and then they stopped, and something else began. The accounts from this period describe furniture moving on its own. A dish sliding across a table. The boy's bed shaking while he lay in it. Some of it was witnessed by the family's Lutheran pastor, Reverend Luther Miles Schulze, who took the boy into his own home for a night to watch him, and who is generally thought to be how the story reached the press. Then the case moved to the Catholic Church, and we hit the first piece of the legend that will not stand up. The popular telling says that a priest named Edward Hughes attempted an exorcism at Georgetown University Hospital, and that the boy tore a spring from the bed and opened the priest's arm with it. It is one of the most repeated scenes in the whole story, and it appears in book after book. Opsasnik could find no record of the admission, and no record of the injury. Nothing at all outside of the retelling itself. That is not proof it did not happen. It is a warning about how much of this we are taking on trust. What did move the family was something they could see. Marks began appearing on the boy's skin, raised, red, and legible. On his ribs, the word Louis. On his hip, the word Saturday. On his chest, a figure reading 3.5 weeks. Whatever you believe caused them, the family read them as an instruction. They had relatives in Missouri. In late February, they drove to St. Louis. A cousin there mentioned the situation to a lecturer at St. Louis University, a Jesuit priest called Raymond Bishop. He went to see the boy. Then he went to see a colleague, Father William Bowden, rector of the college church. Bowden applied to the Archbishop of St. Louis for permission to perform a formal exorcism. Permission was granted. Almost nobody else was told, and from the first night, Bishop wrote everything down. This is where the record becomes unusually good and where it parts company with the film. Bishop's diary is a daily log, and it is dry. It reads like a clinical record kept by a man documenting a procedure, because that is what it is. What it records is a boy who thrashed and had to be physically held, who spat, with considerable accuracy, at the priests around the bed, who swore in language his parents said they had never heard him use, who sang, sometimes for hours, who went rigid, then slack, who reacted violently to holy water and to the crucifix, and who appeared able to tell when an object had been blessed and when it had not. The entry for the 20th of March is among the worst of them. It is largely a record of profanity and bodily fluid. More marks appeared as the rites went on. At one point, according to the diary, the word hell was raised across his body. Now consider what is not in there. No head turning through a full circle, no child floating above a bed, no voice from another century, no crucifix seen, no green vomit. Not one of those things is in the record. Every one of them was invented 22 years later by a novelist. The rites were eventually moved to a secure room on the 5th floor of the Alexian Brothers Hospital on the psychiatric ward. Bowden led. Bishop wrote. And a young Jesuit still in training, Walter Halloran, was there largely because he was strong enough to hold the boy down. During one session, Halloran's nose was broken, and here is the detail that reorients everything. Halloran outlived all of them. He gave interviews before his death in 2005. He was the last living eyewitness to the most famous exorcism of the 20th century, a man who had been in that room with his hands on the boy with a broken nose, and he would not confirm it. He said he never heard the boy's voice change. He believed the boy was repeating Latin he had heard the priests use, rather than speaking a language he did not know. He admitted that when the marks appeared on the skin, it never occurred to him to check the boy's fingernails. Asked directly whether he would state on the record that this had been a genuine possession, he declined. He had never made an absolute statement about any of it, he said, because he did not feel he was qualified to. The witness closest to it was the one least willing to claim it. It ended on Easter Monday, the 18th of April, 1949. Bishop's entry describes 7 or 8 minutes of violence, and then the boy speaking in a tone of complete relief and saying simply that he was gone. He came round. He said he felt fine. There was never another episode. A formal report went to the Archdiocese, and the matter was closed. 2 years later, Bishop added a final note to the file. The boy was 16. He was, in Bishop's words, a fine young man. His parents had become Catholics. That should have been the end of it. On Friday, the 20th of August, 1949, the Washington Post ran a piece by a reporter called Bill Brinkley, under a headline saying a priest had freed a Mount Rainier boy, reported held in the devil's grip. It gave no name. It got the town wrong. A student at Georgetown University read it and never forgot it. His name was William Peter Blatty. The diary itself was nearly lost. It had been locked away in that room on the 5th floor, and the hospital was demolished in the 1970s. Construction workers going through the building found the papers in a drawer and handed them in. Which is how a private log written by a priest for the church alone became a public document. And the boy grew up. Ronald Hunkeler joined NASA in February of 1962 at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. He worked in high-temperature ceramics, helped develop the materials that shielded spacecraft from the heat of re-entry, and held patents on panels used on the space shuttle. He worked on the program that landed men on the moon in 1969. He stayed almost 40 years and retired in 2001. Nobody he worked with knew. He never told them. He never gave an interview, never wrote a book, never sold a word of it. What his colleagues noticed was Halloween. Every year, he left. He was frightened of the film. He was frightened, for the whole of his adult life, of being recognized. And in his later years, he is reported to have grown skeptical about the entire thing himself. That what happened in 1949 had rather more to do with a grieving 13-year-old boy who had lost someone he loved and who discovered that certain behavior brought a great deal of attention. He died in 2020. His companion said a Catholic priest arrived at the house, unannounced, and gave him the last rites. 18 months later, an investigator named J.D. Sword assembled the records while researching a podcast and published the name in the Skeptical Inquirer. So we know now. We know who he was, where he worked, what he built, and what he was afraid of. For 72 years, one thing in this story stayed genuinely protected. Not the diary, which was found by workmen in a drawer. Not the details, which were printed, embroidered, and sold. His name. The priests kept it. The church kept it. He kept it at the cost of leaving his own home every October for the rest of his life. He lost it 3 years after he stopped being able to object. If you like forgotten history and cases that were never quite as settled as they looked, subscribe, because there is a new one here every week. But before you go, sit with the question this case leaves behind. The record does not give us a demon. It gives us a frightened child, a grieving family, a group of priests doing what they believed was necessary, and a man who spent the next 70 years trying very hard to be ordinary. If the worst year of your life became somebody else's film, would you want your name on it?